Interesting, super interesting discussions. So we really want to make sure to offer enough time as much as possible for the discussions to be continued. And therefore, without much further ado, I would like to announce the beginning of the Technology and Science panel, the union of body, mind, and technology. Who is in control? We'll discuss that. And allow me to introduce to you the moderator of this panel, Victoria Gill, who is an award-winning science journalist and correspondent for BBC News and a presenter on Radio 4's weekly Inside Science program. And your, Victoria, BBC World TV documentary, In the Shadow of Chernobyl, won an Association of British Science Writers Award in the year 2020. Congratulations. And most recently, and thank you for doing this, you have been directing your attention to reporting on the potential impacts of active conflict in the vicinity of Ukraine's nuclear power stations. The floor is yours. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes, my microphone is on. That's, tech check to start. Thank you very much. It's so nice to see so many people in this beautiful lecture theatre, because as beautiful as it is, it's beautiful and sunny outside, so I appreciate you all coming in to take part in this discussion. And thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you very much to to UCL for inviting me here today. It's lovely to be here, and I'm excited to introduce this panel discussion about this particularly fascinating, I think exciting, perhaps unsettling, very topical subject, body, mind, and technology. Who or what is in control? We've got three brilliant innovators, researchers, and speakers here for you today on our panel. And before we get this conversation started, I just want to say that as excellent as our speakers are, we, of course, sitting here don't represent the amazing diversity of people and innovators in this field. We had two equally brilliant women who were invited here today, and unfortunately had to change their plans at the last minute. Elizabeth Costa of the Behavioural Insights team and Alexandra Piądraszewska, whose beautiful Polish name I have definitely butchered, but sadly they both had to cancel. And I think you can probably sympathise in these very uncertain times with disrupted last-minute schedules, which is why we're even more grateful to have our brilliant panel here today. Let me just invite my panel to the stage before I introduce you all to them. Please join me. Take a seat. You have designated seats under your pictures. And forgive me in advance for fiddling with this microphone, because it does keep sort of slipping off my clearly very strangely shaped ears. And we'll be talking about these wearable devices, so it's sort of a topical little haphazard accident. So let me introduce you first of all to our wonderful panel. We have, at the end, Joe Devlin. He started in artificial intelligence, appropriately, but then found himself much more interested in just how the human brain works. He's a leading researcher in how the brain processes language and wants to understand why human language is unique in the animal kingdom. Leo Scott Smith is CEO at Tended, the business he started in 2017 to save lives, to create transformative technological solutions to put an end to occupational fatalities. He was one of Forbes 30 under 30 in 2021, which makes me feel very old. Welcome, Leo. And Paul Marsden. Paul is a psychologist who co-founded the, I think, rather excellently named BrainJuicer PLC, which sadly has a different name now, doesn't it, Paul?
It does, yeah, unfortunately.
It's a research... How dare you? It's a research company that uses psychological techniques to understand consumers. He thinks that technology is transforming our identity, our experiences, and our relationships. I'm going to kick off the conversation with some questions to our panel, but I want to, as soon as possible, open this up for a conversation with you all, because I think this is a really exciting area of discussion that we all kind of have a vested interest in. You know, we all have our smartphones in our pockets and our wearable devices. We're all invested in the future of technology, and this is a conversation about leadership and for young people. So it's about the next generation, which this couldn't be more directed to. So I really want to invite you to the conversation as soon as possible. But I'll just start off by asking each of our excellent panelists the rather big question: how much control do we have in terms of the technology that we're interacting with over our own decisions? Maybe I can start with you, Joe.
Well, I would take a pretty hardcore view of this and say we have 100% total control of all of our decisions. That's not to say that we're not influenced by things. For sure we are. We're influenced all the time under all sorts of different circumstances, by people, by tech, by government. It's almost infinite. But ultimately, your ability to make decisions entirely resides within you. Your understanding of how you made those decisions or what forces led you to actually come to that decision, that may not be consciously in your control. But that's not to say that the actual act, the volitional act of making a decision doesn't reside with each individual.
Leo, what would you say about that?
I'd have a slightly conflicting view to that. The
That's
main reason for is, I think, and I feel a bit out of place in terms of two people that really understand brains next to me, but a lot better than I do anyway. But we make one decision every sort of 2 seconds or something along those lines. And if we're making that many decisions, 35,000 decisions every day, I think it's fair to say that of those, at least some of them are going to be somewhat influenced or changed quite significantly through the use of technology, because it's only been the past 14 years since smartphones have been something that we now have almost fixed to our hands, glued to our hands. And those in themselves are helping us to make better decisions, sometimes worse decisions. And a lot of the work that yourselves are doing around social media and how to better engage consumers in what they're doing, that is engaging them so that they're constantly keeping scrolling through their newsfeed, and those algorithms that are creating the content that is most engaging to those individuals is causing them to be more influenced and then making positive purchasing decisions, which, whilst it was still our decision, they've been heavily influenced, I think. So I think there is a point to say that our decisions are being influenced somewhat by technology.
My lack of trust in my own personal technology has actually made me inappropriately go old school for this panel and revert to my notebook. I don't know what that says about me or the tech. Paul, what would you say about that? Who's in control?
Well, I've just done a survey on this on a film. I just did a documentary movie called I Am Gen Z, which is out looking at sort of Gen Z or Gen Z and teens and tech and their relationships. So we've just done a big survey of looking at Gen Z about their views, so public views, so public perceptions of whether they're in control of their technology or the technology is in control of them. What we found is that both the millennial cohort and the Gen Z cohort, that 75% of people, 3 in 4 teens, or Gen Z and millennials together, think they're addicted to the technology. The technology is in control of them. When you dig down a little bit deeper and say, okay, so how does this play out? And you ask people, okay, would you prefer to give up your mobile phone for a month or give up breakfast for a month? The majority, 56%, will say, I'll give up breakfast.
Wow.
A similar amount of people ask the same question, would you prefer to give up your phone for a month or sex for a month? The majority still say sex. And what's interesting, which is a bit scary, would you prefer to have a broken phone or a broken finger? Over a third of Gen Z will say, I prefer to have a broken finger. So the perception, at least, whilst I'm actually shared those position, like control, but I think the perception is that technology is increasingly in control of our lives and that we are somehow addicted or slaves to the sort of weapon of mass distraction that is this thing.
Does that reliance, do you think, mean control? Addiction and sort of obsession with that device that we're so reliant on. Does that mean it's in control?
If you ask people, the majority, over 70% of Gen Z will say they want to reduce the amount of tech time. They say it's harming their mental health, it's harming their sleep, it's harming their relationships. So whether or not they're scapegoating other things and saying you've got to pin this on iPhones. It's all it's tech's problem. That people do they believe that it is in control of them. But whether or not it is, or whether we've always thought technology is even back from novels. We think these pocket things that people be looking at when we talking to each other and the rest of it. So novels. So we kind of demonize technology, but there is something about this generation. They do think it's adversely affecting them, but it's just so necessary, vital for them.
And that seems to be a generational a generational shift,
Yeah.
and it's about sort of
It's
access to
literally
that
half. So I mean, it's
technology.
odd. I mean, so I'm sort of old age, old Gen X, and we're certainly not going to give up sex for a month for our give up our phone. So,
I'm not giving up breakfast. I don't know about you. Joe, what are your thoughts on that? You know, somebody that studies the human brain, like, what is your reaction when you see that sort of generational shift and this fixation or addiction and reliance?
I think Paul summarized it really nicely when he said that's their perception. So the thing, know quite a lot about addiction in the brain and how that changes part of your brain's reward system. So if you look at brain studies of people who have chemical addictions to smoking or to alcohol or to cocaine, they all show the same abnormality in a part of your brain called the ventral striatum, which is basically where dopamine is produced, which is a reward chemical in your brain. It does other things too, but it's the important reward chemical. What's fascinating is that Apple did a study with a brand guru named Martin Lindstrom in about 2010. I can't remember the exact year, looking at whether people were addicted to their phones, all these people who claim to be addicted. And the reality is that that's not what you see in the brain at all. So that may very well be their perception, but that's not, there isn't a biological basis for that. What they're doing is, I think, exactly what Paul said, which is sort of scapegoating to some extent. It is an important social lubricant at this point. It's something that's prevalent. Like if you don't have the right kind of phone, it can be a social faux pas. And all of that's really important. And of course, in a younger generation, particularly in Gen Z, the social interactions are really critical. By the time you get to old age like me, it's a little bit less so. But so I can understand why people think that, and I can understand that they really value their time with their phones and would even make the kind of decisions that you've described. That's incredible. But I can see people saying that, but the reality of what's happening in their brain chemistry, is that it's not an addiction under the vast majority of cases. I'm sure there are some examples.
Leo, how can that be harnessed for good, do you think? I know you're excited about the potential of our access to technology and improving technology.
So I think there are two sides to that you can look at it. So if you look at it from a consumer perspective, I'm sure that everybody, or at least most people that use social media, will scroll through adverts, and sometimes they can be really useful and really insightful. And I think that there are some benefits there, and I think that that has a big benefit to the commercial world in terms of helping to grow small businesses and helping to bolster up the economy and grow our economy really quickly. But I think that there are also some significant negatives that come with that, which is that the kind of almost wealth inequality that comes from the split between having people like ourselves who are all very privileged to have access to technology, which means that we can better ourselves and we drive this consumerism that unfortunately has a drastic effect to about 75% of the population through the requirement for more natural resources and the fact that we're kind of creating this greater split, and it's only going to get worse as we sort of continue to go on. So I think there are some ways that we can benefit. I mean, a good example from a behavioural perspective is what our company does, and I'm definitely not trying to tag that here at the moment, but we work with behavioural psychology and safety, and the view there is we look at the behaviours of individuals and how they work within a workplace, and then we use different forms of technologies like nudges to help change and influence those behaviours to ultimately make people safer in their workplace. So we've got a really good example working with Network Rail through that our behavioural technology can almost directly be accountable to 2 lives being saved every year in the rail industry. So there are some big benefits that can come from it, but I think, as I say, there are also some significant downsides.
Well, before we go too far down the sort of unsettling fear of technology realm, I wanted to ask each of you what new technologies you're most excited about in this area of kind of influencing or interacting with our decisions and our behavior. Paul, what do you think is most fascinating, inspiring, exciting in our future?
I'm quite excited. I lecture at the London College of Fashion, and the whole fashion industry, uses influencers. So, we get celebrities to wear stuff, we get stuff here sort of put in product placement, and we work with influencers. Problem with influencers, you cannot control them, and they often go off, they go off script and say things you shouldn't do, sort of Britney or whatever. It can all go horribly wrong. So there's a new generation of virtual influencers which basically just digital avatars, but they're used by LVMH, used by Gucci, used by Porsche, and I think it's really interesting. And some of the research we're doing, people actually trust fake people, so virtual influencers, more than human influencers, because that there's no ambiguity about it. They're being paid to wear the clothes. They're being paid to promote a product. You never really know whether it's Kim Kardashian. Does she really like it, or is somebody paying squillions to do it? And so I think it's really interesting seeing the rise. So I think the rise of sort of digital virtual influences is really fascinating, and it's one step into the metaverse and this kind of hybrid living where you kind of start having sort of virtual humans. So I'm a big fan of that.
That unsettles me for some reason, the virtual influencer, the bot influencer. I don't know. Joe, what about you? What really kind of inspires you in the technological realm?
I think the prevalence of biometric devices, so the fact that everybody's wearing an Apple Watch or a Samsung Watch or a Fitbit or whatever, is transformative, actually, because we're doing it for nominal health purposes. You can monitor your steps, you can keep track of your heart rate when you're doing, you're working at the gym, whatever. But of course, those companies are actually monitoring the data. So for instance, Google bought Fitbit, not because they really care about your health whatsoever. Google has an enormous amount of analytic data about what you're doing online. And now, for the people who are wearing Fitbit, they can also monitor your physiological reaction to what you're doing online. And I think that there's both sort of good and bad in this. I think that there's a lot of interesting potential to do really, really innovative science and understanding emotional engagement and how narrative and advertising, but also like real content, short films, TV, radio, all of that can be influencing people in terms of their actual autonomic nervous system, which we can get an indirect measure of at the wrist. And I'm excited by that. I think that there's an immense potential for creepiness here. But I sort of would rather look at it in terms of its potential for doing good things of the sort that Leo's talking about. But we need to be aware of some of the other downsides as well.
Yeah, the influence on us to have more healthy habits because of the technology that we're wearing on our wrist is a positive thing.
Even I think just even understanding whether it's consumers or the public, if you're sharing a public health message and you want to see how it lands, well, now you can do that in a way that you never could do before, right? If you had focus groups of 5, 6 people and you get their opinions, there's all sorts of problems with that. But if you're sort of saying, well, look, across the UK, there are 20 million people wearing these devices when this message is playing, I can get a real-time estimate of how well people engaged with the story. That's a very, very powerful tool for trying to refine our comms.
Yeah. And Leo, you touched on it already in terms of the work that you're doing. I don't know if outside of that realm or in addition to what you talked about, what do you kind of have your eye on?
So I think it's around all of the data that is being generated all over the world, but in particular around IoT data. So there are sensors, billions of sensors all around the world that are gathering all kinds of data, whether it be air quality, whether it be whether machines are on, how fast people are driving. And we're now seeing this movement within the sort of enterprise B2B software space where they've gathered all of this data and they've displayed it on dashboards to senior leaders within that organization. They've looked at it and gone, well, I don't know what to do with this data. And people are now using that data to sort of tag on to the back of it to say, well, let's use that data to try and influence people's behaviors to make a change to those things. So I'll give you a really good example. One of a company that I've worked with quite closely, they have sensors within vehicles on construction sites. And one of the biggest challenges that our world is facing at the moment is climate change. And these vehicles that idle, which is basically they just sit there running instead of turning them off, they'll idle for 30, 40% of a working sort of day. They're now providing nudges to the people that are driving those vehicles and saying, hey, you need to turn your vehicle off, and as a result, they're reducing the emissions on these sites by as much as 30%. Now, if you expand that into things like aerospace, there's a really amazing company that is working with pilots to change their behaviours around how fast they're accelerating during flight up into the sky. That doesn't mean that these planes are going to start dropping out of the sky, but what it does mean is that they're going to get to a point where they're using less fuel for them to get up to where they need to be. And this means that all of a sudden, through a lot of sensor data and a lot of sort of clever, small behavioral changes, we're able to make huge impacts in terms of the way that, or the amount of carbon emissions that are being given out by these vehicles. So that's just one prime example about how all of this sort of massive amount of IoT data is now being used to help change behaviors.
Sort of newer technologies helping the older technologies to be much more efficient.
Can I give one more just example? I think just more basic things, having said virtual influencers. I think what we've seen in Ukraine has been absolutely fabulous about technology being used for good. You're seeing charity NFTs being sold to raise money. You're seeing Elon Musk Starlink, so you got mobile internet. But every day, people around the world who are familiar now with big platform technology, going to Airbnb, being able to book a place in Ukraine that you're never going to stay for, buying digital downloads from Etsy. You're seeing people seeing the public mastering technology and using technology for good. And that's really uplifting. And I think it's a really real positive thing.
You need some uplifting elements for it with the news at the moment. So I wanted to get some basics out of the way as well for the purposes of my own, solving my own ignorance. So the metaverse, can one of you please explain that to me? What is it? How is it going to change our lives? What does it mean?
I mean, I'm happy to take a lead on that. I think the best way to describe it is a virtual world, which is very often required to be sort of accessed through a set of VR goggles or potentially AR, but it's very heavily sort of led on VR. And the idea is that you can recreate any kind of world that you have now in this virtual world. My personal opinion on it is that there's an interesting, if you look at the pure kind of like hard data points, you've got one of the world's largest organizations changing their whole brand name to Meta, which is Facebook, on the view that this is where they see the future going. Now, I think it's hard to say whether that is going to happen or not. I think they're looking very far ahead. I think they've got to, because I think they've got a lot of challenges at Facebook around engagement and what Apple's introducing around privacy, which is obviously having a huge impact into the performance of that organization. But one of the bigger challenges that you have with the metaverse, from my opinion, is that you need an enabler, which is that piece of hardware which allows you to access and enter into this metaverse. Now, I've had the fortunate sort of chance to try most of the kind of premium right down to the consumer end of these different AR and VR goggles. They're really not that good. Really good example, 10, 12 years ago, a company called Magic Leap was created, $3.5 billion of funding. They released their first product after almost 10 years. It was a massive flop because the technology just isn't quite there yet. And what that means is that this concept of the metaverse is being banked on technology that still has quite a way to go, in my opinion. I mean, the biggest problem is more around just wearing a headset for a long period of time. It gives you a terrible headache. It makes you dizzy. You know, they need to solve some real basics before this whole concept of the metaverse becomes something that I think we can really bank ourselves on.
Right. And neuromarketing, perhaps, Joe, you're someone that can explain that for us.
Sure. So neuromarketing is a term that's been used to sort of motivate the introduction of neuroscience tools into sort of marketing PR areas. And the reason for that is that for years and years, traditional market research approaches have used sort of question and answer kind of approaches, focus groups, surveys, interviews, things like that. And that's fine. It's a perfectly sensible thing to do, is to ask people why they make those decisions or what's important to them. But it's also very limited. There's a lot of things that are going on below the level of conscious awareness in most people. There are also social biases in the way people respond to questions. So there's a lot of reasons that if you just ask somebody, they don't always get an answer that's accurate. And it's not normally that they're just trying to be a pain in the butt. So we know that those limitations exist, but we also know that all of that decision-making is happening inside of our brain, in our nervous system. And with the advances in neuroscience, there's a real interest in being able to use some of these extra tools, whether it's biometrics, which is widely available, all the way through electroencephalography or fMRI, which are tools designed to measure brain activity. I'm going to say directly, but it's not entirely. And the reality is that there's an awful lot of interesting science going on there. There's some really good neuromarketing going on. There's some snake oil happening. And that's inevitable. Anytime you introduce new tech to a field, there's sort of a boom-bust, Gardner hype cycle kind of thing going on. But I do training in neuromarketing for industries who are interested, because a lot of them want to know what you can do and what you can't do. But if you go to neuromarketing firms, they have a vested interest in saying, well, what we do is really good and what everybody else does is really wrong. Whereas as a university professor, I don't really have that kind of vested interest. I could tell you what's available and what isn't available, and I'm not going to profit one way or another through whether you go and work with a neuromarketing firm. Yep. So I just see that as sort of an important type of education, but I think it's an area that's increasingly of interest to a lot of companies. And the reality is a lot of companies have dabbled in it. Some companies have delved deep into it at this point.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Paul, about the sort of ethical dilemmas that what Joe was talking about raises there? Then, how much should we be told? How much information should we have about what information is being gathered about us? How do where does the regulation sort of fall short or tie in? What would you say about?
I think there's a big disconnect between the market research, which is survey-based, and I again, please subscribe to Joe's stuff, but it's good for getting at least public perceptions rather than reality. That there's a big disconnect. So you've got a bunch of academics, such as us, and professional people saying, this is quite worrying. So you probably remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal. If you actually ask the public, what do you think about Facebook or others profiling your personality based on your likes and then targeting ads to you based on your personality profile that's inferred from your online behavior? It's two thumbs up. It's cool. I get less screen spam. I get more relevant ads. People like it, and so I was sort of super surprised. I mean, similar thing with if you have the war going on at the moment, laws, lethal autonomous weapons systems, which are otherwise sort of known as killer robots. If you ask the British public, and the Germans and the Americans are completely gung-ho about it. They think these things, these drones, you can say, go kill person X, and then they just go off and do their thing autonomously. People think, well, it's saving humans' lives. You don't need soldiers. It's just a more effective way of warfare. And for me,
the public are
generally for it, and it scares the willies out of me. And the same with.
I'm surprised by that. You were saying that earlier, and that the support for that does actually really.
And the same with I'm getting targeted ads. I get ads all day. It's kind of like it's just not a problem. I got my ad blocker. I don't really care, and if I see an ad, I feel that I'm in control. And I think there is we do tend to worry as academics, I think, maybe sometimes too much about the consequences there's going to have to catastrophize about the effects.
Where do you see, I guess this is kind of to all of you, where do you see the technology moving quicker than the ethical discussions and the regulation can catch up? Where do you see that we're sort of marching ahead with what we can do before we've figured out how to sort of control it and whether we should? Leo?
We had a very interesting conversation about this before we started, and the challenge that we have is that technology is moving at an exponential rate. There's the Moore's law of the fact that every 2 years the amount of silicon that we can get into a chip is doubling, and that means that our processing power is accelerating massively. And something that when you talk about technology, people automatically jump to Facebook, Google, Amazon, but actually the consumer side of investment in technology is significantly smaller than the business side. And that business side, the more money that's invested into the business side of technology, that means that the more acceleration we have in terms of this exponential growth of technology. But the challenge that comes with that is that regulatory sort of challenges and the simple process of putting regulations in place is a very complex and long and laborious challenge, which means that technology is always going to accelerate significantly quicker than we're able to put regulations in place. So I would say that in nearly all places, technology far exceeds the sort of state of the regulations around it. And unfortunately, unless we change the way that we structure how we're introducing new regulations, I think that's going to be the case and forever, really. And that does introduce a significant challenge.
And Joe, where do you see that challenge that Leo was talking about there sort of coming to a head, or what examples would you give of where it will be a particular quandary with human behavior and influence over it?
Right. Well, one of the things that's interesting is sort of what's known as remote biosensing. So everybody knows that if you're wearing a VR headset, you know you're wearing a VR headset. If you're wearing an Apple Watch, you might forget, but you know, basically. The question is, what if we could start getting that information without touching you, without you being aware? So for instance, there have been recent advances in eye tracking technology. So when I was a graduate student back the last century, to do eye tracking, you had this horrible setup with this gross bite bar, and there was kid all around you. It was the most painful and unpleasant thing I'd ever experienced in science. But nowadays, particularly due to the gaming industry, there's a lot of ability that's basically built on that sort of Nintendo Wii kind of technology, right? That you can sort of get fairly decent eye tracking. It's not what we would use in a lab, but it's actually quite good from your laptop camera. So when you're looking at your laptop, you don't tend to think of the fact that it's looking at you, but there's no reason why that camera can't be used exactly that way. And to just give you a specific example of how you can use this that I haven't seen used commercially, but I've seen done in the lab, which is that my colleague Daniel Richardson did this experiment where he asked people to decide on yes/no answers to sort of morally ambiguous questions. Is it ever okay to kill somebody? Those kind of questions. Is it ever okay to lie to your spouse? Whatever. And of course, people vary in terms of, it's not an easy one. And what they did was they didn't put the yes and no up on the screen initially, and then they put it up and they track where their eyes are. And if your eyes are on one of the items and not the other, and you then say, okay, now you need to decide, you significantly change how often people will say yes or no. So you can simply use this basic remote sensor tech that people didn't even know was available to influence. I don't think you can change, but I think you can influence these decisions. And of course, the same kind of thing exists with biometrics. Deloitte is doing this in City Airport, where they have billboards that have cameras in them that aren't obvious to most people. And not only are they tracking your face and where your attention is, but they're actually trying to to measure your heart rate as well. That doesn't work that well outside of the lab, but it doesn't now. I suspect it will in the next few years, because there's an immense interest in making it work.
You mentioned creepiness earlier. I think we're definitely touching into that territory there, in my view. Is there any information about our behavior or our decisions that technology can't get at that would be valuable, or you don't see a prospect of technology being able to access it? Leo?
I think technology, I was going to say technology at the moment can only access the information that you're really giving it, but I think Joe has just proved that very wrong. I think that we're in a state at the moment where, our kind of general thoughts can't really be accessed by technology, but I think that over the next couple of decades, we may see that changing through the things that people like Elon Musk with his Neuralink and the many other organizations working on these products that are going to tap directly into our brain could potentially change. And I also think that and I definitely won't know as much about this as my two other panelists, but I would assume that as part of this process of algorithms gathering lots of information around your activities, they can start to pick up a much deeper understanding of how people's brains are working. So even in that sense, you could say that they are still accessing your sort of unconscious thoughts, I guess. But I think there is still a point of, depending on what situation you put yourself in, you can always be in a position where technology can't access everything.
And can I get you, perhaps Paul, I can ask you about Neuralink and that kind of technology. That does seem like something that's kind of further into the future. Joe, you probably have some thoughts on this, given your area of expertise. But actually directly tapping into and implanting your brain to have an interface between your brain and the internet. What are your thoughts on that? The possibilities for it, people's willingness to take that up, the possibilities for what it could achieve?
I think there's again, I'll defer to Joe on some of the sciences, more the perceptions. But you've got a lot of people at the moment actually leaving Neuralink, saying the hype and the PR vastly the science just isn't there. It isn't there yet. But you are seeing people getting more easy with their relationships with technology. So, for example, if you ask people, there's a new generation of sex robots that are out there at the moment.
I wondered how soon that had come into the conversation.
No, I'm all about sex robots. Go to Kakashi.ai. There are these cyber-brothels.
Get your questions at the ready.
Yeah, all around Europe. So in Berlin, 140 euros an hour to go and see it. Because they cost quite a bit, these sex robots. They got personalities, and they basically there for your pleasure and live out your fantasy, your sexual fantasies. But if you ask people today, would you, if you had an opportunity to have a relationship with test out a sex robot, the majority of people, and bizarrely Germans much more than the Brits, would say yes. But then the relationship gets a bit weird, because then if you say, well, if you had if your partner had a relationship with a sex robot but didn't tell you, would that count as cheating? And people think, so, and the majority of people say, well, actually women more than men tend to say, yes, that would count as cheating if my partner had a relation with a sex robot. But then we've got this thing in technology called the uncanny valley. When technology gets too human, we kind of it's a bit too creepy. But it doesn't. The research that I do, people are actually getting more at ease with that. So whereas things to the Neuralink, I think people are more open to more technology in their lives, and almost the science fiction version of it, which sometimes is more than the science can actually deliver at the moment. But you probably know a little bit more about Neuralink than me.
Well, I would say that that's absolutely my perception of what's happening with Neuralink. Years ago, I did a program with Mike Mosley at the BBC called Inside the Brain. And Mike at one point said to me, well, how much of the brain do you think we understand? And I said, oh, well under 1%. And they stopped filming. They're like, I'm sorry. You can't say that. And I said, what do you mean I can't say that? And they said, well, that sounds really depressing. And I said, no, that's really exciting. The reality is that we are scratching the surface. We understand something about the way the fundamental processes happen. We have really detailed information about how brain functions work at different levels, from like physical to chemical to cellular to systems. But what we don't know is how they work together, and how they work together gives us behavior and understanding and emotion and all that is us. And I would say that we don't have a very good grip on that at the moment. I like to believe that we will get there. I don't expect that'll happen in my lifetime. Now, mind you, my lifetime is perhaps a little bit less than some of the people in this audience. But I think that there's an awful lot about what makes us human, and that wouldn't be any different for any other species, right? That we just don't really understand at this point. So I think that there's a lot of potential for development, which I find exciting, but it means that we don't know as much as perhaps sometimes comes across with Elon Musk and Neuralink.
Yeah. What, Elon Musk being smug about what he knows? Surely not. I'd like to really invite you all. We've got about half an hour left together, and we have to wrap up by about 3:45. So I'd like to invite you all to the conversation. I really hope you have some questions for our fascinating panelists, as much as I would love to hog the chat here. So please do. I don't know if we have microphones, or we just have excellent acoustics in this. Yes, we do have a microphone. So we have a microphone up here, which will be duly brought to you. So if you'd like to raise your hand, if you have a question directed to any one of our particular panelists, then please do say. And it would be lovely if you'd like to introduce yourself, but no pressure. So we have a question up here in the middle. The microphone's coming your way. I saw that hand first. Sorry, that's probably me. And we've got another user up here next.
Is there a button on it?
We can hear you,
yeah. My question is, to any panelists, what technologies that are in place right now are you afraid of?
Ooh, that's a good question.
If you can't think of one, what do you think is going to be in place that you're afraid of?
existing or imagined future technologies that frighten you.
Predictive policing.
Ooh, do go on.
So it's kind of like, you're probably all too young, but there was a kind of very young Tom Cruise did a Minority Report movie where you kind of predict when somebody's going to commit a crime. And that's actually being used, this technology now in London, where you can predict not necessarily who's going to commit a crime, but where's going to be a crime is going to be committed. And so the surveillance capitalism, I think, is a real issue. And people are, so that kind of scares me, this kind of techno-totalitarian state where you're being surveillance, that worries me.
Well, maybe you will have thoughts on this. It's a big question, isn't it? Leo, what scares you? You're very positive about technology.
I am. I actually did a TED talk on how technology should be perceived positively as opposed to so negatively, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about. I think anything to do with defence and the growth of technology within the defence sector, I think something that's kind of a little bit unknown is that a lot of technology innovations actually come out of defence and the work that they're doing there. And I think there are some real concerns around potentially how large populations of people are influenced by technology. We've talked very briefly about Cambridge Analytica and the impact that that's had on our country. And I don't want to get into the politics, that was earlier's panel, but you had the Trump coming into power. A lot of that was said to be down to the challenge of how it was manipulated through Facebook. And I think recently Facebook, or a few years ago, they kind of said, look, we were kind of part of the genocide that was happening in Myanmar. And I think that as things like Facebook and Twitter become more prevalent in more developing nations, I think that could help to potentially fuel some of the already very sort of fragile politics that happen in those countries.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing a pretty horrendous example of that, right?
Exactly, yeah, 100%. I mean, I think a lot of Russians believe that what's going on at the moment is right, and that will have been heavily influenced through the power of sort of data and how they're influenced through social media channels.
Control of information. Joe, what scares you?
I suspect I might be the only PhD in artificial intelligence who also is a bit of a Luddite. So at some level, all tech, I have a healthy respect for its dangers. I think Facebook is the thing that I get most anxious about. I almost wore my Mark Zuckerberg as a lizard t-shirt today, but my wife convinced me that was just a step too far.
This is being live streamed. We had a question up here at the back, I think. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name's Casper. Professor Devlin, you've mentioned that Deloitte uses eye tracking technology at City Airport, but you didn't explain what they do with that technology. I'm just interested in that.
Sure. So they have these dynamic billboards, which obviously you just play ads for, and most billboards these days are digital and they change. But what Deloitte did, which was kind of cool and mildly creepy, is they built a little camera into the billboard so that they could track, as people walk by, how many of them, for instance, turn their face to look at the billboard, and how many of them actually stop and look. And obviously they know what's playing on the billboard at that time. But then on top of that, what you can do is some sort of very basic kind of calculations like, well, is this a man or a woman based on the face that we're looking at? And therefore, we can perhaps give them ads that might be relevant to them. What is unclear, so Deloitte admitted that they were doing this when they sort of got caught, but they didn't say exactly what they were using it for. But it's not particularly difficult to follow Leo's point and connect it with better data and sort of say, okay, well, that's Joe. He's a frequent flyer. We know that Joe's here, and he will often get something for his kids on the way back, so I'm going to feed him ads that are potentially relevant to him. And Joe, may sort of say, oh, that's really helpful, actually. I really like that. It's convenient. Or I might be creeped out by it. But that tech is actually, certainly exists at the moment. It's very easy to do. And we don't know exactly what Deloitte is using it for, other than that they're creating these kind of remote sensing analytics that they then sell to their ad partners and say, well, 6% of the footfall stops in front of your ad when it's played at this time of day, etc.
Thank you. And we have another question just behind me here.
Hi, my name is Veronica. So my question is, in this DNA age that, as you previously mentioned, the tech companies are gathering more and more information about us, information that we're not even aware of is being gathered. Is there any hope for consumers, for online users, or just simple people to kind of preserve at least our privacy, at least like partially, or is it just becoming less and less likely the further we go? And yeah, what are your opinions about that? No particular speaker.
I think Zuckerberg has said it's like privacy, isn't that like a 19th century concept? So I think
But he's a lizard.
he's oh yeah, and this is live stream. So I think I was lucky enough to go to Bhutan a couple of years ago, looking at a small little Himalayan country, and they do something quite, well, do a number of things quite marvelously. One, instead of simply measuring GNP per capita growth, they measure GNH, gross national happiness. So the goal is happiness. And one thing that is really interesting that they do is that from primary school, kids are taught digital literacy. And including the role of digital surveillance, disinformation, and so I think digital literacy. And we talk about we all work in academic institutions, and I think digital literacy is really important. So I think the hope is that we might not be able to control the strings that move us, but at least if we can look up and see those strings, that's sort of one step on the road to sort of liberation from our data masters. So I think digital literacy is the answer for me.
I 100% second that. I think that there needs to be more done at a very young age around making children more aware of technology and actually what it's doing and how they can protect themselves better. But I do think that there presents some opportunities as well. So there's a company, if any of you watch Dragon's Den, you might have seen it, but that I know, which they're called Generate with an 8 ads, and they basically have a browser that plugs into Google Chrome, and instead of you using Facebook, Google, or whatever it be, that is then basically generating money off you, you then have the opportunity to generate money by sharing your data with a number of these providers. So, all of us in this room, we are just dollar signs to these big corporations in America, and if there is this opportunity, I think, going forward, where actually, particularly with what's going on with the sort of Web3 and the decentralized sort of network, where we can actually start to be recognized for our value and start to see some gain out of the back of it, and actually our data and our personal information is sort of recognized for the value it's worth, and hopefully people will start to see some kickbacks off the back of that. I think Apple's going that way as well. Anybody that's got an Apple phone that's got the latest update, and now every app you go on, it says, do you want to share your data? And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm straight into the no, I don't. And I think that is going to be one of the ways that some of these sort of more powerful organizations go, and Apple hopefully is leading by example, much to the sort of anger of the Facebooks of the Googles of the world, I'd imagine.
Yeah, where our data is basically their currency.
Exactly, yeah.
Joe, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I agree with both.
And we had a question up here, and then we had one in the middle over here. So we'll go. Do you have a microphone?
Hi,
one
yeah.
and then two.
Thanks. I'm Jacob, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think the government should go about our addiction and reliance on technology? Should it maybe still keep that conservative approach for privacy and non-disclosure, or maybe start actually using and relying more on locational data to understand what's happening in the population?
So are you talking about regulation?
Yes. So basically, yeah. So I'm talking whether it should be still more like the rules, whether they should be strict about using the data and how actually the government uses the data. Because we've been talking about how companies use and gather data, but I feel like the government still does not use it like properly in terms of, for instance, very, very simple example, census data. We still rely on gaining information about the population from census, whereas actually census every 10 years is particularly not really relevant for us now. But we feel like, you know, we don't use the location, that the government does not use locational data. So basically the question is whether they should be still kind of away from that, or maybe they should, you know, put their feet in.
Should the government be using our data, and how should that be regulated? Okay.
I think it came
in.
it came into its own in the pandemic when you know everybody had the NHS app, and you know maybe it wasn't necessarily the most reliable when it was looking at contact tracing, but it played its purpose. And at that point, that's a really good example of them looking at how they can use data to their advantage on kind of like a mass scale. On a sort of regulatory perspective, as part of that question as well, I would say that, and we were discussing this earlier as well, is that the government is introducing these huge, significant fines to technology organisations into the billions. And I think that what would be really good is actually if the government started to use some of those sort of that revenue generation, should we call it, that they're gaining from these fines to put towards speeding up their regulatory processes that we were talking about earlier that are currently sort of very delayed. The biggest thing that came in terms of regulating how data is used was GDPR, and I remember that in our business when it was coming out, we all sort of threw our toys out the pram and go, oh, how are we going to do anything? And then all of a sudden it came in and we went, actually, it's not really made that much difference. And that is the biggest thing that's happened over the past kind of decade for regulating data. And to be honest, it wasn't enough, and they could be doing a lot more, I would say. But there are some great examples of them using data to better them sort of their activities.
Can you imagine sort of Boris Johnson and Mark Zuckerberg having a love child? It would just be a nightmare. No, I think it's really scary. You're going to give me nightmares. So thank you for that question. Yeah. So no, the more government can stay out, you know, yeah, so libertarian, the data, sort of data valence, or I think is government using tracking us. And it's being used to good, I mean, it depends on your politics, but in China, it is used. And so you get social credits when you're being nice to each other, so the government will know if we're being nice and friendly to each other, and say they'll open certain doors, such as, and we've seen it with the vaccine pass, whether it works, whether not. So I think there are big issues, but should the government be spying more on us? It kind of depends on your politics.
I really want to dig into that. You don't have to answer this or not, but are you pro happiness sort of the calculation of people sort of doing good in China or not then? What do you think on that? Because that's always the big one that comes up when you're kind of looking at the Chinese politics and how they're using data and things.
No, because I'm fundamentally a libertarian. So
okay.
But that it can have positive social, large-scale positive effects, and that you can actually nudge people to be nice to each other because of the rewards they're going to get, and to be kind to each other, and to promote generosity through nudging, which it is. Well, yeah, if you believe in that kind of paternalism, then it comes down to pure political choice. Yeah. And
do you think that could come over to sort of Western society as we?
I think
see some slight.
The pandemic has really been quite illustrative of that, hasn't it? Like how much we're willing to cede control and cede our data, even when it comes to something as important as public health. You by traveling in the pandemic, you can see the different responses from different populations and the different approaches from different governments, and just how much people are willing to sort of go along with that. What's your view, Joe, on the how much the government should get involved in gathering our data?
I would definitely be a data libertarian as well. I think the digital privacy issues are important, and I am the person who says no to every one of those cookie questions. But I mean, I actually have tools on all of my devices to block all of that. Right. So the government's incompetence during the COVID situation with the NHS app and things made me feel more relieved, because look, it's not hard to imagine that if they were a little bit more competent and they were just simply using our sort of tracking data that they could have gotten from Google, that you were getting every month sent to you from Google as to where you are, then they could have been finding people left, right, and center for moving more than 6 meters from your house or 50 meters or whatever. And it was never clear what it was. But, you know, there were an enormous number of stories of people who would walk to the park and then both get fined because they had coffees in their hand or something. And clearly they weren't exercising because they had a coffee. And, you know, that was playing out at the same time Dom Cummings was driving hundreds of miles. So if they were using the data in any sort of sensible, competent fashion, I think that the risk of sort of almost totalitarianism is unprecedented. I mean, I think we are talking 1984, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley kind of style. And the fact that they seem as incompetent actually makes me feel a slight sense of relief towards that.
Yeah, I had a story from a friend in Singapore who went out with the zone that he was allowed to travel, just walked accidentally too far.
Right.
And a van with the authorities turned up, picked him up and arrested him. So, you know, it really is, it's been sort of night and day and incredibly political. It's been fascinating and somewhat scary at times. We had another question here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the panel. It's extremely interesting, and I'm Marlena. Anyways, I have two questions, and actually one of them was already answered about the Chinese surveillance system. I was about to ask you, like, what do you think about it, and whether it's going, probably some of the other countries are also planning or willing to implement this system, and what do you think about it? If you know anything more, I'm super curious. And the second question is related to the technology that you talked about that predicts when and where a crime might be committed. And I'm really, really curious how that works. So if you could elaborate a bit on that, I would be super thankful.
Thank you. So first of all, the China surveillance, any other views on that, takes on that?
Yeah, you didn't give me your view.
Yeah, what's your view, Leo? Tugging on that thread.
I think it's fascinating. I think if there's any way that we can make people behave in a better way, potentially it could be beneficial. But I do think that it is also very worrying that somewhat of a very authoritarian government can have control of such personal data in terms of your day-to-day activities. I've got a personal kind of anecdote of the Chinese system of surveillance where, so we do work in China, and I went in and they take a scan of your face, and then on exit, if you have been caught by any of their cameras through facial recognition jaywalking or through not wearing a seatbelt in a taxi, you'll be fined, and if you don't pay that fine, you're not allowed to leave the country. So there are some really serious, and these are cameras that are, I've never seen so many cameras in one city than I have in Shenzhen, which is kind of the tech hub of China. So yeah, I'm not for it, but I do think there are some potential gains if we do it ethically that could come from that.
Pros and cons. Typically non-committal scientist answer there. But, Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I personally find that kind of surveillance unbelievably creepy and offensive. But, you know, look, I'm also a middle-aged white guy, and I'm the least oppressed group that there is. You know, I'm the oppressor, sadly. But you know, that tech is being used against the Uyghurs, for instance. Those kind of cameras are being used to identify Uyghurs based on facial recognition and patterns of association outside of essentially what amount to camps, so that, you know, they can't hide. And that is terrifying to me. I think, I'm sure I don't know a tenth of what's actually happening, but I know that tech is being used because it's been widely reported at this point. I just think that the potential for misuse is so great by government that although I believe there is potential for good as well, and really strong potential for good, I think that as long as we don't have control over our own data, that's where I get worried. I feel like as long as we have that principle that we can control our data, and you own your data, and you can say what you will and will not give out, I'm okay. Once that's violated, then I feel very insecure.
There's also the unintended consequences. And I sort of work for a company that, well, client whose name will remain anonymous, but they use AI technology to do employee satisfaction. They want their employees to be happy. They want you to go to work and be happy. They want happy, smiley people. So they got this little camera that's sold through AI, and it measures the amount you're smiling when you get into work. So it counts whether you're smiling. And so you get these weird conversations between your line manager. Make sure you're smiling as you come in through the office by the camera, and you think, my God, it's like living in some dystopian hell. But I mean, it's the unintended consequence of this when you then try and game the technology.
Yeah.
So
what exactly are you measuring? That's, that does sound very 1984.
And also, there was the thing on the predictive policing. So again, Joe, you'll probably have more intimate knowledge of it, so I know more about the public perception. But the way that it works is that you don't have some, in the movie there was these empaths. You could read the future and see whether somebody was going to commit a crime or not. But what this does, it just uses data. It looks at patterns, where crime's going to be committed, whether people are in groups or not. It profiles people by skin tone, sex, age, and the way you're working, and so it can actually predict where a crime is going to be is likely to be committed, and so then you can deploy police to it. What's interesting, if you ask the British public, do you think the police should be able to arrest somebody on using predictive policing technology alone? And the answer is yes. So people believe that this is good technology because they'll need proof afterwards. But should you be able to stop and somebody because the public are for it? I don't know what you think, but it's kind of weird. Just kind of using data analytics about past behavior, how tall I am, how fast I'm walking, who I'm with, the time I am, where I am, and based on that, you get somebody saying, "No, I'm stopping you now," and it's like, really, haven't actually committed a crime yet. So
we have about less than 10 minutes left together, and I've got a question here and then a question at the back. Please do save your chats for outside the room, just as a courtesy to our lovely panel. So I think we'll probably only have time for those last two questions. We might have one more quick one, but can I take a question from you?
Yeah, so hi, my name is Matthew, and I have a question on kind of corporate responsibility of tech companies, and mainly social media like Facebook. And so in the last 4 years, I think like Mark Zuckerberg has been in the U.S. Congress probably like 10 times, basically. And there's a lot about how there's a lot of discussions about where is kind of the line of how much free speech there should be in tech and social media, and where do these companies kind of cross a line. And where does kind of technology cross a line regarding kind of us being able to post what we want? Because in the last 10 years, I was too young to kind of experience the 2000s, the early 2000s. But I guess like in the last 10 years, technology has influenced so many things in our history. So like politics, culture, economics, like. Where do you blame kind of I'm gonna be politically kind of biased, but like where do you blame Facebook for Trump being elected, for instance, or where do you kind of blame Facebook of not crossing the line in some African countries regarding...
So where do the technology companies come in and have a role in that sort of censorship or free speech? How much is it incumbent upon them to take a role?
Yeah, quite recently, I think BBC also made a report, the research team made a report in how the metaverse is supposed to be like a safe virtual space, but already I know it hasn't been like properly like available to the public, but already you can see that there's a lot of harm and there's a lot of explicit content and like vulgar content that shouldn't be there in the metaverse. So how do you address that? How do you go around that in terms of technology? And yeah.
Thanks. So let's just take that question, a note of that question. I'll just take this next question because we've not got long left, so we'll take them both at once.
Yes. So thank you very much for the thought-provoking talk. My name is Kaya, and I was wondering more about the neuroethics, but also, I guess my question is, will there be a point where we get too excited about the new technology, about changing the world, and then we make a mistake and the technology goes overboard? Will we be able to kind of repair it with more technology? Would that be acceptable to repair a technological mistake with more technology, or rather not?
What sort of technological mistake are you talking about?
Skynet.
Well, something that could possibly harm the humanity in the future. I don't have a very specific one.
Okay, so a hypothetical technology goes too far, and can we fix it? Okay, that's great, thank you. So let me start with this, with your question about, Matthew's question about free speech, censorship, sort of, Paul.
I think that's a really, I've got a quite strong, and I think there's a simple solution to this. I think it comes down to, I'm not sure it's necessarily free speech. I'm a libertarian, so I believe in that, people's right to say what they want to say. Where it gets tricky is whether or not these big platforms such as Facebook are publishers and therefore responsible for the content. And I think there is a really simple solution. When a post is algorithmically promoted, you see it because it's promoted via an algorithm, then Facebook becomes responsible for the content and has the same duty of care that any other publisher happens. If we can just get that law that algorithmically promoted content that the platform is responsible for in the same way whether BBC or any other presenter, I think that would solve a lot of the problems. Right now we don't have that. So I think it's, for me, maybe I'm dodging your question, but I'm not sure that sort of where the responsibility lies, but where it definitely, I think it lies, is where where Facebook intervenes and promotes a particular post because it does incite, it does grab attention, so they can sell more ad space, and then they are publishers. They are literally publishing the content. So I think there's a lot of nonsense around. Well, we're not publishers. Well, if you're promoting content, for me, you are. So that for me, that would be that's where the line gets crossed when they promote content.
And since we've only got a few minutes left together, let me move on to that question about the suggestion of technology going too far. Will we be able to fix it? Who would like to tackle that hypothetical situation, Skynet?
I mean, I'll just put a really quick sort of one into that. I think it's already happened. I don't think it's something that's in the future. I think that one of the biggest examples that we've got with it and of technology fixing it is the climate crisis. One of the main reasons that we have this climate crisis at the moment is because of the massive amount of consumerism that's driving all of these decisions, whether it be people flying around the world or whether it be people wanting expensive, cars that kick out loads of emissions or wanting the brand new iPhone every year that they come out. And there are some incredible technological solutions that are now looking at harvesting carbon and taking this carbon out of our atmosphere. And I think that one of the things that's fascinating is artificial intelligence is only really been intelligent for maybe 10, 15 years. And as things like quantum computing are introduced and become more affordable, problems that we see as big problems now potentially could be solved through technology, because technology will get to the state where it can think and process significantly faster than even a big group of people can, and hopefully solve some of the big challenges that we currently face.
Joe, can tech fix tech's mistake?
Well, I may take it back even further. I mean, Socrates argued that reading and writing was a technology too far because it would fundamentally impair people's brains. They would stop having to learn and remember things, because if you could just write it down, you could cognitively offload. Then you would fundamentally destroy human beings. And arguably, reading and writing is probably the main tech that's led to where we are now, precisely because of that. So if we could go to a society that was post-industrial, in the sense that we could go all the way back before reading and writing, maybe that would solve it, but I think that's pretty unlikely. So I would say it's an inevitable spiral that speeds up. And the thing is, we have no choice but to keep up, and even better to lead, right? To be proactive and think about, what are these ethical issues? What are the things that we want for our society? What are the things that we don't want? How do we try to stay in front of that? And I think that these kind of discussions, and the fact that you guys will no doubt be the leaders who are making these decisions in corporate and government, in charities, in a relatively short period, if you aren't already, that's the responsibility that we face. That's what we have now, and all we can ever do is do what we think is individually right, but we can't duck it. There's no going back.
Thank you. Really, as I could keep this going all day. This is so fascinating, but we only have a kind of couple of minutes before we have to wrap up. So unfortunately, we've got no more time for any of your excellent questions. And thank you for everybody that contributed to the discussion, because they really were such thought-provoking questions. So before I let you all go, I just wanted to give you all kind of a final big question. Any thoughts from you to kind of wrap up this discussion about the future of technology and the influence on the way we think and our decisions? Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always used metaphors. So when we had in psychology, when computers were big, we started to think of the brain as a computer. And before, I think we're now going into an age where we're starting to think of ourselves as algorithms. So, if I talk to you, you're going to respond to me in a certain way. If I smile to you, you're going to say, if this, then that. I think the way that we're going to start thinking about people and other people as a set of algorithms. So, your next love interest will be a certain set of algorithms. I think this algorithmic thinking is going to become a metaphor for the future, based on our understanding of technology and algorithmically driven life. And so I think, when you start seeing, okay, am I in love with your algorithms? It's going to be a key question about, do you want to pair bond with somebody?
It somehow feels quite reductive to sort of hear it described like that you could be kind of drilled down into an algorithm. So I don't know why. Leo.
I think that everybody in this room is probably here because they're interested in technology, and that means that at some point, probably in the next few years, you're going to end up in a field that in some way or another will have the ability to influence technical development and the way that things go. And in the medical field, you have the Hippocratic Oath. There isn't something similar for technology. I genuinely believe there really should be, and people working in technology should sign into something that very similar says do no harm. And until that kind of version for technology of the Hippocratic Oath exists, anybody that is going into that field, hopefully all of yourselves, should at the back of your mind have that thought of, I want to do no harm. And if you do see Mark Zuckerberg, give him a bit of a slap and say, you should be doing no harm. I think we're all the leaders and we're responsible for what happens. We can only be the ones to blame if things go wrong. So you've just got to do the best you can.
Joe, thoughts for the future?
I think that in the best form, tech allows us to be more than what we are. Whether that's just the ability to cognitively offload, that is to say, to store information that you can then access, or to, nowadays to argue about fine points of movie lore by pulling out your phone in the pub, but you have this access to information that we've never had at this level, and that's going to continue and amplify. And I think that it will lead to devices that allow us to implant in our brains or in some socket kind of form that gets away from putting a VR headset on or doesn't require us to hold like a physical device in our hand. I think that's all going to happen. And I think that that's going to happen because we want it to happen, because it makes us more than what we currently are. And the only way we can ride that wave and succeed is through digital literacy, making sure that we're thinking about these topics. And, when Paul says the public demands these things, that's why people deliver them, right? So that's the reality. So how do we do it right? How do we do it exactly as Leo said? I think that that's on us, but it's going to happen because it transcends what we currently are. And that happens at an increasingly fast rate.
Thank you. And thank all of you. It's just been the most fascinating discussion. You've all just been honest and incisive, and it's really, the time has just flown by. So thank you very much. Can I ask you to thank your fascinating panel?
Thank you.
And thanks all very much for your brilliant questions. Do keep the conversation going through the rest of the event. Enjoy.